The desert was endless. A vast sheet of scorched earth stretched to the horizon, where the sky bent and wavered in the heat like molten glass. To most men, it was a place to be feared, a place where time died, where the sun peeled flesh from bone, where silence swallowed prayers before they could rise. But to Nathaniel Cross, the desert was a mirror. Every mile of dust and stone reflected back at him the pieces of himself he'd rather forget. He had been riding since dawn. His horse, a grey gelding scarred from old battles, trudged with a patience only beasts possessed. Nathaniel's eyes were tired, bloodshot, and his hat brim cast a shadow across a face carved from years of violence. The revolver at his hip clinked faintly with each step of his horse, a reminder that no man travelled alone out here, not if he wanted to keep breathing. It was near midday when he saw it. At first, just a dark shape against the pale sand, too small to be a wagon, too still to be an animal. He thought it was nothing, some traveller's trash, maybe cloth blown from a cart, but something in him stirred uneasily. Out here, things that looked harmless often weren't. He slowed his horse to a walk, hand brushing the grip of his colt. The closer he rode, the more wrong it felt. The bundle wasn't lifeless. It shifted, barely but enough to break the illusion. A scrap of fabric lifted in the hot wind, revealing a pale face beneath. Nathaniel's throat went dry. He dismounted, boots grinding into the cracked soil. The air felt heavier near her, as though even the desert itself recoiled from what lay there. She was wrapped in a blanket. No, not wrapped, bound. The quilt was tied at her arms and legs, knotted tight as if someone had meant to contain her. Stains darkened the fabric, spreading outward like black blossoms. And then she whispered. Her voice was like glass breaking, thin, sharp, and unforgettable. "Just kill me fast." Nathaniel froze mid-step. He had heard dying requests before. Soldiers begging for their mothers, outlaws begging for mercy. But this wasn't begging, it was a command, a plea sharpened by terror. He crouched beside her, shadow falling over her features. She was young, too young to wear the ruin, etched into her face. Her lips cracked, eyes half shut, breath rattling shallow in her chest. But there was something in her gaze that struck him. Not weakness, not resignation, but a strange, fierce knowledge, as though she had already seen the end of her story. He reached out, fingers tugging at the corner of the blanket. He told himself he was ready for blood, for broken bones, for the aftermath of savagery he had seen 100 times before. But when he pulled it back, the world shifted. Her arms were carved with symbols. Not scars from knives, not brands from cattle irons. These were deliberate, arranged, etched into her flesh like scripture. Circles within circles, jagged lines, patterns that burned into the eyes and refused to leave. He felt dizzy just looking at them, as though the desert tilted beneath his feet. And then he saw movement. At first he thought it was her breath stirring the wounds. But no, this was something else. Beneath the skin along her ribs, something was alive. The flesh bulged and slid, slow and deliberate, like the surface of water disturbed by a predator lurking just below. Nathaniel staggered back, his boots scraping the dirt. His stomach clenched as bile rose in his throat. He had seen plague rot, men eaten alive by fever. He had seen worms crawling from wounds left untreated. But this wasn't sickness. This wasn't infection. This was something waiting. Her eyes snapped open, locking onto his. For an instant the desert went silent. No horse breathing, no flies buzzing, no wind. Just the weight of her gaze pinning him to the earth. "You can't. Save me," she whispered, blood flecking her lips. "You don't understand. Just kill me quick." Nathaniel's hand hovered near his revolver, fingers twitching. But he didn't draw. He couldn't. Not until he knew. Not until he understood what he had stumbled into. His voice came out low, gravelly. The voice of a man who'd buried more friends than he could count. "Who did this to you?" Her lips trembled. A tear slid down the grime of her cheek, cutting a clean line through the dirt. She gathered the last of her strength, and her voice cracked out one word, one name. The sound of it cut through Nathaniel like a blade. He stumbled back a step, not because he didn't recognize it, but because he did. It was a name he thought buried in the graves of his past, a name he had sworn never to speak again, and the moment it left her mouth, the desert no longer felt empty. It felt haunted, like something unseen was already circling, already listening. Nathaniel's heartbeat thundered in his ears. His eyes darted to the horizon, scanning the shimmer of heat. He had the sudden, violent urge to draw his revolver and fire into the emptiness. Anything to break the feeling that the earth itself was holding its breath. The woman coughed, the sound wet, broken. Her hands, scarred, trembling, clutched at his arm with surprising strength. Her nails dug into his sleeve. Her eyes widened, and for the first time fear gave way to fury. "Don't let him find me," she rasped. "Don't let him take it back." Nathaniel's skin crawled. Take what back? But before he could ask, before he could steady the whirlwind tearing through his chest, the thing beneath her ribs shifted again. Harder this time, enough to push against her skin like a fist pressing outward. Her body convulsed, a scream clawing at her throat but dying as a choked sob. Nathaniel lurched forward, torn between instinct to help and the urge to run. He pressed his hand against her shoulder, forcing her still. His other hand hovered near his Colt. "Stay with me," he muttered, though his voice trembled. "Stay with me, damn it." Her head rolled back, her hair spilling across the sand. She coughed blood onto the dirt, and the desert drank it greedily. Then her eyes met his one last time, wild, desperate, knowing. And she said something that turned Nathaniel's blood to ice. Not a plea, not a cry, but a warning. "He's already coming." Nathaniel didn't move, couldn't move. The name the woman whispered clung to his ears like a curse. He hadn't heard it spoken in years, but it came back to him with the taste of iron in his mouth, with the memory of smoke thick in the air, and with the sound of men screaming in the dark. It was a name that belonged to the kind of man who didn't just kill, he hollowed people out. Nathaniel had seen him once, a long time ago, when the war ended and the border towns were still bleeding. He thought that man was dead, left in the bay. Ashes of a burned church, where a dozen innocents had begged for salvation that never came. But now a dying woman in the middle of the desert whispered his name like it had never left the earth. Nathaniel's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching along his cheek. His instinct screamed to draw his Colt, to look over his shoulder, to put bullets into every shadow the desert offered. His horse pawed nervously at the dirt, nostrils flaring. Even the animal seemed to know something unseen had stirred. The woman's grip tightened on his sleeve. Her nails cut through the fabric, pricking his skin beneath. She was fading fast, but her eyes burned with a fevered clarity. "You don't understand," she rasped, each word dragging blood from her throat. "He isn't a man anymore, She coughed, body jerking, a violent shudder that made the symbols on her arms glisten with fresh blood. "He wants it back. You can't let him." Nathaniel's voice came out low, gravel grinding in his chest. "Wants what back?" Her mouth opened, but only a weak hiss escaped. Her eyes rolled back for a heartbeat, and for a moment he thought she was gone. But then, with sudden force, she pulled herself half upright, almost nose to nose with him. "You'll see," she whispered, voice trembling like glass on the edge of breaking. "It's inside me." Nathaniel felt the chill roll through him despite the desert heat. His eyes dropped to her chest. The thing beneath her ribs shifted, again harder now, pushing against her skin as though testing its prison. For one horrifying second, he thought he saw the faint impression of fingers pressing outward, reaching. The woman collapsed back, gasping. Her strength was spent. Nathaniel sat frozen beside her, torn in two. One half of him, the side trained by years of war, vengeance, and blood, wanted to end it quick, to grant her wish and put a bullet through her heart. The other half, the half that still clung to some ragged shred of humanity, refused. There were too many questions, too many ghosts tied to that cursed name she spoke. He holstered his Colt slowly, forcing his hand away from the easy answer. Not yet. But even as he made the choice, the desert itself seemed to shift. The air grew heavy. The sun dimmed, its glare swallowed by a veil of clouds that hadn't been there a moment ago. Nathaniel rose to his feet, scanning the horizon. He knew this feeling. He had felt it once before, years back, in the minutes before a massacre that left an entire town in silence. It was the sense that something unseen was watching, that death was circling. The woman coughed, her voice cracking. "You can't let him find me. Promise me." Nathaniel looked down at her, torn between pity and dread. "Lady, if he's who I think he is, I can't promise anything. But I'll try." Her eyes fluttered, a faint smile flickering across her lips. Strangely peaceful, almost resigned. But then her body jerked again, violent as though the thing inside her had heard those words and rebelled against them. She screamed, a raw, tearing sound that echoed across the wasteland. Nathaniel clamped his hand over her mouth, desperate to silence her. Too late. Far in the distance, across the shimmer of heat, something answered. It wasn't the cry of a bird. It wasn't the howl of a wolf. It was deeper, stranger, a sound that seemed to crawl through the earth and shake his bones. Nathaniel's blood ran cold. His horse reared, nearly breaking free of the reins. The woman's eyes went wide with terror. She clawed at Nathaniel's arm, her mouth spilling blood and broken words. "He's coming." And Nathaniel realized, with sick certainty, that he hadn't stumbled upon her by chance. No, this was a message, a trap laid out in the open, and he had just stepped straight into it. The desert did not forgive sound. Every noise, every hoofbeat, every whispered prayer stretched thin under the sun until it became something else entirely. And what Nathaniel Cross heard now wasn't the cry of a wounded animal, nor the howl of wind. It was a sound that should not have existed in daylight, a sound that belonged to caves, to places beneath the earth where men had no business wandering. It started as a tremor in his chest, a vibration low and crawling, making the hairs rise. On his arms. His horse felt it too, snorting, eyes rolling white, jerking at the reins until Nathaniel had to wrestle it still. The gelding's muscles quivered like wire ready to snap. Beasts knew. They always knew. The woman lay in the dirt at his boots, half wrapped in her filthy blanket, body twitching as though the sound itself were crawling under her skin. Her lips moved, whispering something that wasn't words, just broken syllables, carried on breath. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, yet her hands still clawed at the ground, reaching for something unseen. Nathaniel knelt, pressing a hand to her shoulder, but she thrashed like a wild thing. He leaned close, his voice harsh, demanding, "What is it? What's coming?" Her throat rattled, spitting blood into the sand. Finally, words tore free. "Not coming. Already here." The words slid under Nathaniel's skin, cold despite the searing heat. He turned his head slowly toward the horizon. The desert wavered in the sun, a broken mirror of heat mirages, endless and shifting. And yet among the shimmer there was a figure, small, far away. Walking. Nathaniel blinked sweat from his eyes, half convinced it was just another trick of the light. Men often saw ghosts in the desert. But the figure didn't. Vanish. Step by step it pressed forward, steady as the march of time. He knew that gait. God help him, he knew. Years peeled back in Nathaniel's mind. Years of trying to bury the memory under whiskey, under the smoke of gunfights, under every scar he had carved into himself. But memory had claws, and it dragged him backward, whether he willed it or not. He saw fire again, a church burning, screams of women and children trapped inside, pounding against the boarded windows until their fists fell silent. He remembered the man who stood in the glow of the fire, calm as scripture, watching lives turn to ash without moving a finger to stop it. His name was a wound that never healed. And now, the woman had spoken it. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, and, for a long moment, he thought of drawing his Colt, firing into the mirage and hoping lead could reach ghosts. But his hand wouldn't move, because deep down he knew lead wasn't enough for something that should have died years ago. The woman suddenly convulsed, body arching off the sand. The blanket slipped, revealing more of the carved symbols on her skin. The cuts and burns glistened fresh, though some looked decades old. They wrapped around her arms, her collarbone, disappearing beneath the torn fabric at her chest. And as Nathaniel watched, they seemed to shift, not like scars, like writing being rewritten. He recoiled, heart hammering, bile rising in his throat. He had seen men branded, whipped, flayed. But this was no man's handiwork. This was alive, crawling, changing. Her mouth split open in a scream, but the sound was not hers alone. Something inside her screamed with her, a layered voice, human and not, bleeding into one. The desert air trembled with it. Nathaniel slapped his hand over her mouth, desperate to choke the sound before it spread too far. Too late. The figure in the distance stopped walking. Nathaniel's breath caught. The desert went still as death. For one heartbeat he almost wished the figure would vanish, prove itself a phantom of heat and fear. But it didn't. Instead, though still too far to see clearly, it raised its head. And Nathaniel knew it was. Looking straight at him, the woman's nails dug into his arm, breaking skin. Her eyes rolled back into her head, foam flecking her lips. Between broken breaths, she rasped words that stabbed into him like rusted knives. Don't let him near me. If he takes it back, the earth won't hold him this time. Nathaniel bent closer, desperate, shaking her by the shoulders. Take what back? Tell me what it is. Her head jerked side to side violently, hair whipping across her face. Her voice dropped into a whisper, lower than before, raw, as if it came from her bones. It's not a thing, it's me. Nathaniel froze. The symbols on her skin burned darker, almost glowing beneath the crust of dried blood. And for the first time, Nathaniel wondered if the woman in front of him wasn't a victim at all, but a prison that was breaking. His horse screamed again, ripping at the reins. The sound from the horizon began anew, louder, closer, a vibration that made the ground tremble beneath his boots. Nathaniel's instincts screamed at him to run, to shoot, to end it, but his hands refused. His whole body was caught between mercy and dread. The woman's eyes snapped wide, wild and pleading. "Kill me now," she shrieked, her voice cracking, like thunder. "Do it before he arrives, before he—" Her body jerked. The bulge beneath her ribs surged outward again, and this time Nathaniel saw it clear. Fingers, pale, slick fingers pressing against the inside of her flesh, dragging down her ribs like claws scratching for release. Nathaniel staggered back, nearly falling over his own boots. His Colt was in his hand before he knew he'd drawn it, barrel aimed at her chest. His finger curled around the trigger, shaking. But he didn't fire, because in the distance the figure began walking again, and each step felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of the earth. The desert had a way of swallowing men whole, and Nathaniel Cross felt it now. Every inch of the sand beneath his boots pressing against him like the weight of every life he had ever failed to save. The fire he had built hours ago had dwindled to embers, long streaks of smoke curling into the night sky. Shadows of the jagged canyon walls danced across the sand as if alive, reaching toward him, whispering secrets only the dead could understand. The woman sat a few feet away, wrapped in her tattered blanket, motionless yet vibrating with an energy Nathaniel could feel through his bones. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, reflected the faint glow of the dying fire. She had not spoken since the day he found her in the desert, and every silence was heavier than the last. It was as if the night itself waited with bated breath for the horrors it promised would unfold. Nathaniel's thoughts drifted back to the first time he had ever faced real death, not in the form of bullets or knives, but the kind that seeps slowly into your soul. He had been 17, and a man named Crowley had slaughtered a town for sport, leaving charred corpses in the streets, while Nathaniel hid behind crates, feeling the stench of smoke and the taste of fear burn into his lungs. He thought he had buried the memory. He thought he had escaped it. But now, as he watched the woman, he realized he had only delayed the reckoning. The woman's lips twitched. For a moment, Nathaniel swore he heard a faint whisper, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "Do you see?" Her voice was weak, rasping, carried on a breath that smelled of blood and dust. Nathaniel leaned closer, squinting, trying to catch her words. She coughed violently, and he felt her hand brush against his arm, cold and trembling, her nails cutting shallow lines into his skin. "See what?" he asked, voice rough but steady. She took a shallow breath, forcing the words out. "The shadow, they are not mine alone. He walks in them. He always walks in them, and he will not stop until it is returned." Nathaniel felt bile rise. in his throat. He had thought he knew fear. He had stared into the eyes of men who killed without conscience, men who burned and stole without regret. But nothing he had seen compared to the weight of her words, or the darkness that seemed to press in from the canyon walls themselves. He tried to pull her closer, to protect her, but she resisted in a way that was almost supernatural. Her body jerked violently as if something inside her was struggling to break free, thrashing against the blanket that bound her. Nathaniel gritted his teeth and held her down, feeling the heat of her fear mingle with the cold dread that had settled over the desert. And then, from the horizon, he heard it, a footstep faint at first, like a ghost brushing over the sand. 1, 2, 3, growing louder, heavier, resonating deep in his chest. The desert seemed to quiver in response. His horse reared, throwing Nathaniel against the dry earth. The woman screamed, not in fear this time, but as if warning him, as if her own body knew something he could not yet grasp. He struggled to his feet, dragging the blanket-wrapped figure behind him, eyes scanning the horizon. And there it was, a shape, barely visible yet undeniable, moving toward them across the dunes. The gait was human and yet inhuman, deliberate and calm, as though it was untouchable by the very laws of nature. Nathaniel raised his revolver, hand trembling violently. He had trained himself for every conceivable horror of men, but this was not a man. It could not be a man. Every instinct screamed at him to fire, to end it, yet no bullet could pierce the dread that rolled across the desert like a living thing. Satifo, woman's eyes met his, wide and urgent. Do not let him touch me! Nathaniel's finger hovered over the trigger, and for a long, shuddering moment, he considered the only choice that could possibly protect her, ending her suffering before the figure arrived. But something in her gaze, wild and unyielding, stopped him. Not yet. The figure moved closer, each step sending vibrations into the earth that Nathaniel could feel through his boots, rattling his very bones. Shadows from the fire leapt into the air, stretching unnaturally long, and the woman's body convulsed violently, the marks on her arms and chest glowing faintly under the moonlight, as if responding to the presence of something older than the desert itself. And then the whisper came, not from her but from the canyon walls, the desert floor, the very air around them. He will take it. He will always take it back. Nathaniel shivered, realizing with a sickening certainty that what they faced was not merely human. It was ancient, relentless, and tied to the woman in ways he could not yet comprehend. For hours, he watched the horizon, every shadow twitching, every sound amplified in the still night. He did not sleep. He could not. All he could do was sit beside her, holding her trembling form, knowing that by dawn everything would change, and that the desert had already claimed them in ways he had never imagined. By the first light of day, the embers had gone cold, the horizon bled pale gold, and the figure in the distance had drawn nearer. Nathaniel's resolve hardened. Whatever this was, whatever haunted the woman, he would face it. He had no choice. The desert had chosen him, and there was no turning back. The desert stretched endlessly before Nathaniel Cross, each dune a wave of heat and shadow, each crevice a whisper of the past. He rode slowly, the woman still wrapped in her blood-stained blanket behind him, her body fragile, yet somehow vibrating with a terrible energy he could not name. The air itself seemed to shiver with anticipation, carrying a chill that contradicted the sun's glare. Every breath tasted of ash and metal, as if the desert itself had consumed countless horrors and now exhaled them upon him. Nathaniel's mind raced, recalling the warnings she had whispered, the trembling terror in her eyes. Do not let him touch me. He will take it back. Those words clung to him like a chain, each link a memory he had tried to bury, each memory a shadow of death he thought he had left behind. The horizon rippled. Heat waves twisted like molten glass, but beyond them a shape emerged, unmistakable, moving with an unnatural calm that belied the distance. Nathaniel's stomach clenched. The man, or whatever it had become, walked with the inevitability of the desert itself. There was no hesitation, no fear, no mercy. Every step pressed against the sand like a drumbeat of doom, and the earth seemed to acknowledge it, quivering beneath his boots. The woman let out a low, tortured moan, clutching at the blanket as if it could shield her from what was coming. Nathaniel reached out, gripping her shoulder with a desperation he had not felt in years. "Stay with me," he whispered, voice trembling. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Her eyes met his for a fleeting moment, wide with fear, but also something darker, recognition. She had seen it before, she knew it intimately, and the thought of its return had carved her soul like a knife. She tried to speak, to warn him again, but only a broken sound escaped, a rasping echo of the terror that had defined her life since the moment it first touched her. Nathaniel's heart pounded, memories surged unbidden, a burning church, screams, that had burned themselves into his memory, men left to die while he hid in the shadows. He had faced killers before, but nothing had prepared him for this. This presence was older, darker, beyond comprehension. It was not merely a man, it was a force, ancient and hungry, and it carried with it the weight of every atrocity it had committed and every soul it had ever claimed. He urged his horse forward, careful not to disturb the fragile balance between life and terror. The woman trembled behind him, her body convulsing in a rhythm that seemed to resonate with the distant footsteps approaching. Nathaniel glanced back once, catching the faintest shimmer in the distance, the figure growing, expanding, stretching like a shadow come to life. The sun glinted off something metallic in its hand, though it was too far to see clearly. Each step closer sent vibrations through the ground, as if the desert itself acknowledged its march, and Nathaniel felt an unfamiliar panic claw at his chest. Hours passed, though time itself seemed fractured in the desert. Each dune, each shadow, each sound was magnified into a grotesque symphony of dread. The woman's breathing grew ragged, shallow, but her eyes never closed. She was awake, fully aware, as though the presence approaching fed her terror and kept her alive at the same time. Nathaniel kept his Colt ready, though he knew bullets could not contend with this. He could only wait, watch, and brace for the inevitable confrontation. Finally, the figure drew near. Its form became unmistakably human, or at least the outline, of a man, tall, unyielding, impossibly calm, every motion deliberate, predatory. The air around it seemed to warp, the heat bending into unnatural shapes, shadows stretching toward Nathaniel like fingers. He felt the desert recoil beneath him, stones trembling, dust swirling. The horse whinnied in panic, straining against the reins. The woman's voice broke through the tension, raw and urgent. "Now! Now, before he sees me like this!" Nathaniel's fingers curled around the trigger. He looked at her, the intensity of her plea burning in his eyes. Every instinct told him to obey, to grant the release she begged for. But another voice, his own buried beneath decades of violence, shouted to resist, to fight, to survive, to protect. The figure slowed, stopping just beyond the shimmer of heat. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. He could see it clearly now. The man, the monster, the force of years of death and cruelty made flesh. Its eyes gleamed with knowledge and malice, and when it spoke, its voice carried across the desert, deep and resonant, shaking the air itself. "Bring her to me." Nathaniel's world tilted. The words were not a threat, they were a command. The desert seemed to acknowledge them as law. He felt the weight of inevitability pressing down, a mantle of doom he could not shrug off. The woman screamed, and something inside her shifted violently. Her body arched, hands clawing at Nathaniel's arm with inhuman strength. Symbols on her arms seemed to glow under the rising sun, twisting and writhing, responding to the figure that had emerged from the horizon. Nathaniel raised his Colt, aiming not at her, but at the shadow advancing. He fired, the sound cracking like lightning across the desert. The bullet struck the sand before it, harmless against the impossible presence. The figure didn't flinch. It only smiled, a slow, terrible curl of lips that promised pain, retribution, and death beyond imagining. The desert roared in reply, the wind screaming, stones tumbling, and Nathaniel realized that there was no escape. Not for him, not for her, not for anyone foolish enough to wander these cursed miles. And then The first contact. The thing inside her surged outward, breaking the fragile boundary of flesh and fire, and the desert held its breath as man, woman, and horror collided in a storm of blood, shadow, and unrelenting terror. The desert was quiet now, but the silence was a lie. Every grain of sand, every shadow cast by the canyon walls seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what was to come. Nathaniel Cross stood in the center of the basin, the woman before him trembling, her body alight with unnatural energy that made the very air warp around them. The figure from the horizon had arrived. Its presence was immense, pressing down on the earth, distorting the heat and light. Its eyes glinted with centuries of cruelty and knowledge, a predator whose hunger could not be sated. Nathaniel could feel it in his bones, a weight like iron, a pull that seemed to drag the desert and everything in it toward inevitable confrontation. The woman screamed, a sound that split the air and reverberated through the canyon. Something inside her shifted violently, breaking the fragile boundary between human and whatever it had become. Symbols burned across her skin, glowing with an unearthly light. Her body twisted and arched as if she were both prisoner and weapon, and Nathaniel realized with dread that she was the key, she had always been the key, to this ancient, merciless force. Nathaniel raised his revolver, shaking. Bullets were meaningless, but he would not abandon her, no matter the cost. His heart pounded as he stepped forward, placing himself between her and the figure, defiance and fear warring in every fiber of his being. The figure spoke, voice like rolling thunder. "Give it to me. Let it return." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. Never. The desert seemed to shudder. Dust and stones rose into the air, a miniature storm conjured by the sheer power of the being before him. Lightning split the sky, though no clouds obscured the stars. And in that storm, the woman's body convulsed once more, glowing brighter, screaming silently with power that Nathaniel could barely comprehend. Time fractured. Seconds stretched into hours. The figure advanced. Nathaniel ran forward, grabbing the woman's hands, holding her as close as he could, praying that his human will could shield her from what was coming. The collision happened without warning. The desert exploded in fire and shadow. Nathaniel felt the force of the ancient power slam into him, tossing him to the ground, scraping the skin from his arms and face. The woman cried out, not just with fear, but with the full weight of what she carried inside her. The figure recoiled, then advanced again, and the battle between human courage, supernatural terror, and raw ancient hunger unfolded in a storm that would be remembered for eternity. Nathaniel fought with every ounce of strength and cunning. He dodged the strikes that no man could survive, shielded the woman with his own body, whispered prayers he had long abandoned, and clung to the one certainty he had left. She must survive. The desert screamed, shadows twisted into monstrous shapes, and finally, after what felt like endless torment, the figure faltered. The woman's energy, wild and incomprehensible, surged outward, wrapping around the being like chains of living light. Nathaniel seized the moment, forcing them back into the canyon, driving them apart from each other, into a stalemate where mortal courage had finally met immortal force. By the first light of dawn, the storm had passed. The figure was gone, or trapped somewhere between worlds. The woman lay in Nathaniel's arms, exhausted, her body slowly returning to something fragile and human. He kissed her forehead, whispered that it was over, though he knew the desert never truly let go of its debts. He had survived. She had survived. And yet, the scars of the night would remain forever, etched into their bodies, minds, and souls. The desert watched in silence, indifferent and eternal. Nathaniel Cross rose to his feet, the woman by his side, both trembling but alive. He looked out across the endless dunes and whispered to himself, "Some things in this world are bigger than men, and yet we fight anyway."